Beth Bergeron. I am the Vice President of the World Affairs Council, and it is my sincerest pleasure to welcome all of you here today. We have a very exciting program this afternoon, and we know that you're going to enjoy it. I would like to thank the sponsors that may or may not be here today. That would be Sir Speedy, Wilbraham Munson Academy, and new within the last couple of weeks, Greenfield Savings Bank is sponsoring the World Affairs Council in our area. Special thank you also to NAI Plotkin and 1350 Main Street, who provide the facility here this afternoon at no charge to our council. So you see any of those folks, make sure you extend our warmest thank you to them. The reason John is here today is through the National World Affairs Council, once a year, they offer the opportunity to our councils to submit names of people who might be interested through the State Department to visit other countries. Other countries host us. We have 2 members here who have been here, who have gone on international trips. One of them is Ken First. He went to Afghanistan in the middle of the war. Thank you, Ken, representing us. We also have, I don't know if Rich Redeker is here, but he visited China a few years ago as the host country. Now, John Young is here as a result of that same program, and he had the opportunity and was invited and was accepted to travel over to Qatar, and he's going to talk today about his visit there and share some of the insights about that country. John is the retired executive director of Better Homes for Springfield, an affordable housing developer and management company. He's also actively involved with the New England Diaconess Association, a senior living nonprofit organization with campuses in Massachusetts and New Hampshire. Following graduation from college, John was in the Peace Corps in Kenya, East Africa, for 3 years. John and his wife, Mary Margaret Young, we all know her as Meg, have traveled extensively, both domestically and internationally. He is a longtime member of the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts, and he's currently on the board of directors. If you've ever attended an adventure in international dining, you have benefited from John's diligent work on our behalf, along with his wife, Meg. He was among a select group of executives and board members from World Affairs Councils across the country, chosen to participate in a World Affairs Councils of America leadership mission to Qatar in October of 2018. This is really quite an honor given how small our council is. He will now report on that mission. Join me in welcoming John Young.
So as Mary Beth indicated, I participated in this leadership mission to Qatar in October of last year. And next slide. As Mary Beth also mentioned, the leadership missions are set up by the World Affairs Councils of America, which is based in Washington. And periodically, countries will offer an opportunity to bring folks to their country to basically get an overview from governmental officials, from cultural organizations, educational organizations, and social organizations. And you typically meet with very high-level governmental or local folks to get a view of the country. And that's what we did in Qatar. We had 15 council members from across the country who were part of the mission. The mission was led by Bill Clifford, who is the CEO of the World Affairs Councils of America. And next slide, please. How do we get there? We actually, amazingly, and I'll speak a little bit about this later, but Qatar Airlines, many of you may know that, and some of you may have flown on that. Fantastic airlines, but they provided all of the air support for folks coming to Qatar. They have a number of international, number of American hubs that they fly out of. It's a 13-hour flight from Philadelphia, is where I actually left from. And you arrive nonstop in Doha, the capital city of Qatar. And we were met by our two hosts, who I'll speak of some more in a minute. And we stayed at the W Hotel in Doha, which, as some of you may know, there's a number of W hotels in the country. Pretty upper level hotel with a lot of amenities that were really great. Next slide. So this is the view, first view of Doha from the window of my hotel room, looking down on this complex down here. I understood was the emir's kind of summer residence at times, and you're looking across to some of the development that is taking place, and actually part of that upper part, and I'll speak of again a little bit later, but is an artificial island in which a lot of residential development is taking place. So where is Qatar? A lot of people ask, I have not really heard about Qatar. Where is it? So Qatar is like a thumbprint on the eastern shore of the Persian Gulf. Its only land border is with Saudi Arabia. It's a desert country. There's no vegetation, there's no wildlife, and all of their water comes from desalination plants. And Doha is located right on the Persian Gulf. So they're getting all their water that way. The size of the country is about 4,500 square miles, and it's equivalent to basically the size of Connecticut. So this is a map of Qatar, and you can see where Doha is just there, more or less in the center on the eastern side. And down here is the Saudi border, which we'll also talk about some more. And then this shows you its relative position in Asia and Africa. This, I just put this slide in because this was one of the shots that I managed to get that had a pretty good indication of the flag of Qatar. So the population of Qatar is about 3 million people. But the interesting part is that only 10 to 15% of the population are actually Qatari. The population is made up, the Qataris are basically from three groups: the Bedouin, the Hadar, and the Alabed. And the Bedouin were really the kind of nomads in the desert originally. Hadaris were more the town dwellers, the city dwellers, and it's indicated that they were probably descendants of Iranians. That's how they came down from the Persian area. And the Alabed are the third group, and they are, Alabed translated in Arabic apparently means slaves or slave. And they apparently migrated from Eastern Africa back a long time ago. So 85 to 90% of the population is made up of expatriates from many from Britain. As you'll see, British had a connection with Qatar. There are some immigrants, but there are a lot of temporary workers who are brought in primarily from Southeast Asia, and they basically provide all of the manual labor, and most of the service labor as well. And they are mostly all male. There's really not many families that come in. There is also a sizable U.S. population, some of which we'll see. There's about 11,000 American on the Air Force Base, which we'll talk about later. But there's also a lot of business representatives that are in Qatar from all over the world, including the U.S. The language is both Arabic and English. All of our meetings were held in English, and just about anywhere you went, English was pretty spoken pretty much everywhere. In a few cases, we did have translators, but in most cases, it was all in English. And as you'll see from some of the slides, the dress is traditional Arabic, but transfers into English, in Western dress as well, depending on where you are, what kind of meetings you were in, and so forth. Next slide. The religion is primarily Sunni Islam, and the practice is Wahhabism, which is much like Saudi Arabia. You've probably read about that over time. It's apparently a very strict interpretation of Islam, but even though they indicate that that's the formal practice in Qatar, we did not really see a lot of strict application of that. For instance, if you remember reading recently, it was only, I think, within the last maybe 6 months or so that Saudi Arabia has permitted women to drive. Well, in Qatar, they've been driving for a long time. And also, the role of women in society is very advanced in Qatar. We met with a number of women who are in high governmental offices. So they, and they're very active in a lot of the society. The minority religion is Shia Islam. And there were mosques around the city. Occasionally you could hear the call to prayer, which is evident a lot in the Middle East. And in many of the office buildings that we were in, there was usually a room set aside for prayers during the day. People could go down, and it's most of what we saw were men, and I think it probably was restricted to men in most cases. So Qatar's history goes back 4 centuries, in which it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire, was part of the Ottoman Empire. And during the 19th century, one tribal group called Al-Thahani carved out this area that's now known as Qatar, and controlled that area for a long period of time. Because of threats in the early 1900s, the then emir was concerned about the possibility of the Ottoman Turks again threatening to take over Qatar. So he arranged and set up a protectorate with Britain in 1916. And so the British was governed as a protectorate up until 1971, when Qatar got its full independence from Britain. And during this whole period of time, the founding emir family, this Al-Thani, have been basically in control. So the government of Qatar, it's a constitutional monarchy. As I mentioned, it's been in the hands of the Thani family for all this period of time. Most recently, and I think it's probably the 4th or 5th descendant of the family, was appointed the emir in 2013. It has a constitution which it formed in 2005, and the constitution provides for freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, and freedom of religion. And then, probably most importantly, it has what's known as the Shura Council, which is kind of a consultative assembly of, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But it's what kind of brings the regular citizenship into in a participant in the government. It is, as I say, a monarchy. It's a constitutional monarchy, but there are a lot of family members that are part of the government. So you see the heads of many of the ministries are of the family or relatives of the family, of the emir's family. And it was interesting that the emir's wife is very active in the Qatar Foundation, which we'll talk about in a minute, and also the World Cup, which is coming to Qatar in 2022. So the Shura Council, as I mentioned, it's an advisory council to the monarchy, and it was formed in 1972. So it was formed right after they received independence. Originally, there were 20 members of the council, and today there are 45, 4 of whom are women. 30 of them are elected, and I'm not sure how that process works, but apparently there are local and regional elections, and then 10 are appointed by the emir. Those that are elected are geographically distributed across the country. We didn't talk back when we're looking at the map, but clearly the majority of the population lives in Doha or immediately around it. We did not get outside of the general area of Doha, so it's difficult to know how large any of the other towns are within Qatar itself. But apparently those that are in the Shura Council are coming from all different areas of the country, and they represent different levels or classes in the society. Their particular emphasis, as they indicated, was on educational issues, cultural issues, and humanitarian issues. And as time goes on, they're looking for having even a greater role in the government. And as we'll see in the next slide, this is a picture of the Shura Council room. No money is spared anywhere you go in Qatar, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But this was a conference room that we didn't actually meet in this room. We met in a separate room, but then they took us in and gave us a tour of their council room. So the powers that the Shura Council have is they can draft bills, they can review and comment on the decrees which the emir issues. They can discuss and comment on policies related or on issues with regard to the economy or political issues. They apparently have some input into budgetary issues, particularly related to public projects. So that would be like the parks and common areas within the country. They also, interestingly, can request any ministry to come before them to discuss policies or issues, and they can even ask the minister himself to come. And the bills and issues that they take up, they debate until they reach an absolute majority in favor of whatever their position might be. So with regard to education, education is free to all Qataris, including all the way through university. Students also can qualify to go to school overseas, and if they receive or accepted into the program, they get full scholarships to travel to go whatever school they're going to. They get tuition, they get housing. They're fully supported. And interesting also, they indicated that about 67% of all graduates of higher education in Qatar are women. So again, they're really, women are very active in the country, which is somewhat different than what we see or kind of perceived of what much of takes place in the Middle East.
Did they discuss what areas of education they were in? Teaching or business or?
Not specifically, but I mean, there are certainly many folks that are in governmental groups, ministries, and other agencies. I assume that many of them are teaching as well, and in the upper educational areas. So the development of the country, we're going to see a number of slides which will kind of show you how that's all happened. But really development, one of the first developments that occurred in Doha was a hotel, which we'll see in a minute, in 1995. And there just a huge number of new buildings, high-rise buildings throughout Doha, very modern, and some are in traditional Islamic kind of designs, but many of them are I mean, if you were an architectural student, it would be a great place to go just to study the architecture. And it's a combination of both office, hotel, and residential. A lot of folks living in Doha appear to live in these high-rise buildings, whether they're rentals or maybe some type of condo-type development, I'm not sure, but certainly many are living in those kinds of buildings. Many of these buildings are still under construction. What was interesting is that you would drive by and you could see these buildings in some state of development, but there's no construction activity going on at the time you go by, which, if any of you folks have been to China, is one of the major things I remember about China, is that you saw all these buildings half built and nothing happening, just sitting there. So it was kind of a reflection back on that. As I mentioned in the first picture slide, it's called Pearl Island, is the only artificial island that they have built, at least up to this point in time. And they indicate that there's freehold ownership there for foreign nationals. So if you, I'm not sure what the requirements are to be able to do that, but that's an area where you can actually have ownership of property. A tremendous amount of infrastructure growth. You see it in the roads, you see it, and we'll talk a bit more about the brand new metro system that's being built. So this is a picture this is the Sheraton Hotel. And if you can picture no trees, only sand. When we were there, I don't remember where we saw it, but in one of the ministries we were at brought out a picture of this hotel when it was built in 1995. And there was nothing around it except sand, just literally sand. And now this is a park that's, it sits, you can't see it from here, but it sits right on the water. And this is a park that was along one of the major roads. Next picture. These are a few slides of the buildings in Doha. You can see architecturally, you can see just amazing structures. Next slide. This building actually has, it's almost like a grate that's surrounded. I think there may be a picture of showing it much closer up, but just extremely unique buildings. I'll mention again, but you'll notice in the right building on the side there a picture. That's a picture of the emir. And following the blockade, which we'll also talk about in a moment, these pictures of the emir began showing up on buildings. And as we heard from our host, it was nothing that the emir or the government actually decided to do. Some local people started, and I guess it was artists and so forth, started to do these on buildings. And now you see it in a number of different buildings. You'll see that image showing up on the buildings.
John, that's kind of hazy. Does that mean there was a sandstorm going on?
Well, we did experience some sandstorms. I don't remember specifically, but there is a lot of haze. It's very hot and it's very humid. And so you get this, I wouldn't call it polluted air, it's just, haze that is in the area. This is another picture. This is like the Lego building, you know, that, and it just very, very different architecture everywhere. Next slide, please. So here's another, I think that building was actually in one of the other slides, but here you can see the picture of the Emir built right into the thing. Next slide. So a few comments on the labor. Citizenship is only for Qataris, and as I mentioned earlier, that's only 10 to 15% of the population. They're made up of those three groups we talked about. There are a number of folks in Qatar who are connected with businesses and industry. Though we never had any specific discussion about that, they are obviously there on some type of work permits. And then again, the temporary workers, which comprise a sizable number of the population, come there on visas. But those visas can be taken back immediately. If somebody, as I mentioned, many of those temporary workers are working in construction work, in service-related work. So if the jobs aren't there, the visas will be rescinded and they'll go back to whatever their original country is. If you come into Qatar and not a member of the three groups that originally formed Qatar, you can you can apply for legal residency apparently after 25 years. But the conditions are pretty strict in that you have to have income, show income that you can support your living, and you have to be able to speak Arabic. And the other point was that you had to have good character. In other words, you couldn't have been arrested or be in any kind of altercation that would disturb your character. So it was interesting. This is just one shot of some of the workers, these temporary workers. You can see just by their kind of facial profiles that most of them are coming from the Southeast Asia area. Next slide. So the housing, I think I mentioned this earlier, most folks that are foreign nationals or workers are either housed in rental or employee-provided housing. The temporary workers, though we never saw any of this, are apparently housed more in dormitory-style buildings around the city. If you're a Qatari, this is another benefit of the country. There are low-interest loans that are given to citizens, and you can purchase housing, and there are residential communities on the outskirts of Doha, and apparently they're fairly low-density housing districts, and that's where many of the Qataris themselves live. Also, utilities are subsidized. So their gas, auto gas is subsidized. Their utilities for household use are subsidized as well. This is a shot. This was taken on our way outside of Doha. We are actually going to the Air Force Base, which I'll talk about again later. But this kind of can give you an indication of what some of that low-density residential housing was like. We never went through a community to really get a full shot of it, but that's kind of an example from the bus that I was able to take. Next slide. So what's the economy? Well, originally Qatar was a pearling center. In other words, they did a lot of shell pearls, and that was the main source of revenue for up through the 30s, but apparently that industry pretty much collapsed in the 1930s. Oil was discovered in Qatar in 1939, but it wasn't actually produced or wells really dug for production until 1949. Their oil reserves are limited. Actually, you may have read earlier this year that Qatar was a member of OPEC, but recently pulled out of OPEC, primarily because, as I say, their oil reserves are limited, and they're going to basically try to sell on their own without participating in OPEC. But the biggest source of their revenue really today is they have the highest reserves of natural gas anywhere in the world. Most of these natural gas are in the Persian Gulf, but there are apparently ones, wells and so forth on land that they also are drilling from. Qatar also has the highest per capita income in the world. The average, the range is about $128,000 per citizen. So it's a very wealthy country. The future of their economy, and many of the discussions we had with officials, is that they recognize that though they have these huge reserves of natural gas, that they need to diversify their economy for the long term. Those reserves at some point may decline, obviously. So they're looking to build a health industry. As we'll see, they have a huge educational industry already. They're expanding their infrastructure. And they're also a site for a lot of sporting activities. In addition to the World Cup, which is coming up in 2022, as I'll mention later, they also have other sporting centers, and they're trying to draw folks in to use Qatar as a way to have events and so forth around sporting events. The Qatar Airlines, I mentioned also earlier, is a huge airline, has routes all across the world, and they're looking to even expand that. There's a new airport being built to accommodate all of that. As far as Qatar's involvement with the U.S., our exports to Qatar are far exceed any imports that we get from Qatar. But there are 120 U.S. companies that have subsidiaries in Qatar, most all located in Doha. And Qatar is investing in the U.S., and they're investing in real estate, in oil and gas facilities primarily. You may have seen that the Plaza Hotel in New York City is owned by Qatar. They have oil and gas facilities in Texas. Next slide.
Would that be a Qatari citizen or the government that owns the plaza?
I think it's the government. Yeah. We think of the Middle East as kind of a hotbed of terrorism, and what we found, I think, particularly, is that there was no evidence of that in our visits. The security, you felt you could easily travel around. I went out and walked many times, never feeling any kind of concern about those kinds of issues. There's no evidence of any class conflict at the present time. As I mentioned, the significant population of temporary workers who, as I say, are working in service industry or manual labor, and there's obviously large income disparities between what those folks are making and what the Qataris are receiving, and that could potentially result in some class conflicts down the road. The other thing we'll mention a little bit later as well is what the opportunities are for citizenship for some of those folks. Next slide. So the main topic that we heard about, just about every ministry that we went to referred to the blockade. So the blockade happened in June of 2017. the blockade was put on Qatar by 4 Gulf countries, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Bahrain. The question always came up, well, why did they put a blockade on? Some of the reasons that seem to be indicated by a number of folks is that Qatar was too friendly with Iran. Qatar supported terrorism. Qatar was separating themselves from the other Gulf countries because of their both politically and commercially, and as we've seen by some of the fact that they have this huge reserves of natural gas, was kind of a factor. Jazeera, which we'll talk about also, which is based in Qatar and was established by the Qatar government, is too independent. They wanted Al Jazeera shut down because it could either be too critical of what was happening in the Gulf states. And also some indication that maybe there was some jealousy over the fact that Qatar had been awarded the World Cup in 2022. Very small country. Why? And the only time the World Cup has been held in the Middle East, this will be the first time. And were they really the right country to be able awarded that? There was also some comments that Qatar had supported some of the uprisings, the Arab Spring, back in 2011. But all of those issues were denied by all of the representatives we talked with. And there were many indications, as we'll see as we go through, that I think that doesn't support a lot of the reasons that the blockade was put on. Next slide, please. So what happened? So they closed the border with Saudi Arabia, and as we saw on that first map, that's the only land border that Qatar has. 90% of all the food and medicines that came into Qatar came across that border. They restricted air traffic over those Gulf states. So Qatar Airlines, again, a major revenue source for the country, would travel over Saudi Arabia to go west primarily. They cut that traffic out. They couldn't fly over that area. They restricted the movement, closing the border, also closed to any Qataris to travel to Saudi Arabia. And many indicated that they had family connections in Saudi Arabia. And that was actually one of the biggest issues that they had about the whole blockade, is that they couldn't see relatives in Saudi Arabia. So what happened? Some interesting things that did happen. And one of the reasons it gets back to their closeness to Iran is that they negotiated to have all their air routes fly over Iran as opposed to going across Saudi and the other countries, UAE and so forth. So now all the flights going west basically to Europe, the US and so forth fly up through Iran and then back over that way. They've developed, are in the process of developing more ports on the Persian Gulf for both their export and their imports. But one of the most interesting things was that they imported 5,000 cattle. Now, the diet, a lot of milk and milk-related products that are part of their diet. So when it got closed, the border got closed, all of that was cut off. They had no internal, production of that. So they indicated that they imported 5,000 cattle. Now, supposedly these cattle came from somewhere in the Midwest, here in the U.S. How they got there, I don't know. But they brought in 5,000 cattle to build their own dairy industry. And to this day, 18 months since this embargo the blockade was put on, they are now self-sufficient in dairy products. All their milk and yogurt and other dairy products, they now produce their own. What's really interesting is the question came up is, well, where are all these cattle? And because, as I say, outside of what you saw in the development in Doha, there's nothing but sand. So when we never did see or didn't necessarily spend a lot of time discussing that, but they obviously have to be housed in enclosed facilities. It's too hot to be outside. There's no grass, so they have to be fed by imported food. So it's kind of amazing how quickly they were able to solve that particular problem. Next slide. So now this is kind of some highlights of the visits that we made to the various governmental facilities. We met with the Foreign Affairs. They talked about their facilitating negotiations with the U.S. and the Taliban and the U.S. and Afghan government over the Afghan war. And this has been in the news most recently. You can read about the special envoy who's been doing these. Many of the meetings have been held in Doha. The particular emphasis, which we thought was quite interesting, is that they really pushed the U.S. to do this negotiation initially between the U.S. and Taliban, not all together. In other words, U.S. and Taliban negotiate to try to come to some agreeable solutions to certain issues, and then to meet with the Afghan and the U.S. And then once there were some really good progress made, then to bring both the Taliban and the Afghan government together. And that's kind of the way it seems to be playing out. They indicated that they're spending a lot of effort in education and job training for the youth. I think there's about 50% of the Qatari youth are under 20 years of age. So they are putting a lot of emphasis on that. They want to do everything to discourage disruption that might lead to any terrorist kind of activity. There is a memorandum of understanding with the U.S. With regard to cooperation against terrorism, which was signed in July of 2017. There's a lot of sharing of intelligence with the U.S. And couple of the other comments was that, and this is where it's kind of interesting about, if you go back to one of the reasons that the blockade was put on, is that Qatar was supporting terrorism, and the ministry was indicating that they actually were the ones who initiated a memorandum that was brought before all of these Gulf states and had been accepted by them back, I forget what actually the year of that, but it was before the blockade. And they said, it doesn't make sense that we did this, they all agreed, we were initiated this, and now they're saying we support terrorism. The other kind of comment that I think all of us thought was very interesting is that when the U.S. pulled out of the Iran nuclear agreement, it was there was no advanced discussion or indication given to Qatar, or probably for that matter to many of the other Middle Eastern countries before the U.S. did that. And their comment was they didn't think that that was in the best interest of the region. Next slide. Another group that we went to was the Financial Center. They talked about the growth in Qatar. They projected 2.8 to 3% in 2019. They see Qatar as becoming a financial center for the Middle East. They want to increase their exports. As we'll see in a moment, that much of that depends on the natural gas. They're also developing actually a section within the city. It's kind of a business development area, which is again an effort to encourage both investment as well as foreign companies to come in and set up bases or subsidiaries there. And they also indicated a lot of the favorable reasons to set up there. One being that from a tax standpoint, there's a 10% tax, but it's only on profits that any subsidiary, any company, foreign company made from local sales. In other words, if they're working out of Qatar but they're selling to Saudi or wherever, those earnings are not taxed. It's only what's sold in Qatar itself. And the other main comment that they made regarding trying to develop encouraging foreign investment was that all of the agreements are based on English common law as opposed to any Islamic kind of law. What's that? Sharia law. Next slide. I have to confess that I never used PowerPoint before, so I was trying to insert slides that I had from my files, and trying to make them fit into this program was difficult. So part of this gentleman's head is cut off, and so I have to apologize. But this was one of our meetings. This gentleman was at the Financial Center and leading the discussion. This gives you kind of an indication. You'll see some others of what the dress is for a lot of Qatari men. We also went to the Ministry of Defense. We met with a general of the Army there. And most of our discussion at the Ministry of Defense had to do with Saudi Arabia because, again, it's the only land border that they have. They were, particularly discussing the tensions that exist along the border. They indicated that the Saudis had tanks lined up along the border to prevent any movement across the border. He was also making reference to the fact that with all this natural gas that Qatar had, they could have easily used that in Saudi. Apparently they're building nuclear power plants in Saudi, but they could have used Qatar's natural gas if this whole blockade thing wasn't going on. Also went to the Qatar Petroleum Institute, and that's where we talked mostly again about the issues of natural gas and oil. They are expanding their natural gas exploration. As I mentioned, their oil is limited, and they're not exploring for any more oil. They had withdrawn from OPEC, as I mentioned. Qatar provides about 30% of all the world's exports of energy. So primarily this natural gas, but some level of oil. And they indicated that they're selling that energy to about 70 countries throughout the world. They have joint ventures, as we mentioned earlier, with the U.S. as well as other countries, particularly ExxonMobil in Texas. They are also investing in renewable energies, which is, again, kind of forward-thinking, recognizing that at some point their natural gas reserves will be less and possibly become depleted. So they're looking at doing things for renewables. Certainly they have the sun and the heat to do things like solar. They're also converting their buses all to natural gas. And this is a goal they have to be completed before the World Cup takes place in 2022. The Qatar Foundation was very interesting. This is a nonprofit organization that was founded by the Emir's father and his wife, and it's basically set up for educational science and community development. That was one of the quotes that was in some of the literature I had when they first founded the foundation. But its principal thing is education. And interestingly, there are 6 American universities that are represented in what's known as Educational City, and you'll see a slide here in a minute of them. But Georgetown, Cornell, Texas A&M, Northwestern, Carnegie Mellon, and Virginia Commonwealth are all American universities, obviously, all with particular programs, as I say, international affairs. Should go back and mention that our two hosts, one was Kareem, was actually an Egyptian. Both of our hosts work out of the embassy in Washington. They guided us through this whole program. But Kareem is actually Egyptian, grew up in the States. His parents apparently came to the States. I think his father was connected with either a doctor or worked in a medical school. So he grew up in the States, and when he went to university, he went back to Georgetown in Qatar, in Doha. And that's how he got connected with the Qatar government. But Georgetown has a school of international affairs. Cornell has a medical school and so forth. We toured the medical school of Cornell, which was very interesting. But they're not large programs, but it's just amazing that they have 6 different schools that are located there. The Hamad bin Khalifa is actually the Qatar's university, and it's also located on this campus. Again, kind of indication that how many students are now coming in from outside of Qatar. They indicated 49% of the student body is Qatari, and about 51% is coming from across the world. Next slide. So this is a picture of some of that educational city. You can see also how flat things are in the developments around. Next slide. This is also on the educational city complex. It's I suppose it was 10, 15 miles outside of downtown Doha. This is actually the National Library, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. An amazing building, but you can this gives you kind of a picture of it partially. Next slide. We also had an opportunity to attend a lecture that was given at Educational City, but at the Georgetown University campus, and it was given by an economic professor who's working is a professor at Georgetown, and he talked about the state of Qatar's economy, and so some of the points he was indicating that there had been a slowdown in the economy since 2015, that the issues over oil prices, and this kind of goes back to the recession period where, as we know, oil prices were about $100 a barrel and then dropped down to $30 a barrel, which obviously affected their revenue from at least the oil revenue. And they also indicate that over the last 2 or 3 years has been a decline in tourism. And then he went on to mention some of the challenges that he thinks Qatar faces going forward, and some of that is wealth for future generations, job creation. As I mentioned earlier, there's about 50% of Qataris are below the age of 20. This whole residency issue that I mentioned, when you only have 10 to 15% of your population that are only citizens, the question is, how do you build that population up to more permanent residents? So the whole issue of how do you get residency, how do you become a citizen or at least partial citizen came into play. And that there was a need to, for continued outside investment and business growth. And the challenge again about this blockade issue, about being isolated from the GCC, by the way, is known as the Gulf Cooperation Council. It includes 6 Middle Eastern countries, in addition to the 4 that put on the blockade. I believe it's Kuwait and Oman that are part of the general Gulf Cooperation Council. And that was that council was developed to try to coordinate political and economic development in those countries. But because of the blockade, Qatar's been somewhat isolated from that, and that's an issue for them going forward, in his view. The National Library, I mentioned, it's located in the educational city. It was founded and supported by the Qatar Foundation. That picture showed this very sloping building. It's the length of two 747s together, it is got glass walls all around it, so it's very light on the inside. It has about 1 million books in it presently, most of them in English, but it has a growing Arabic collection. Qatari residents have free access to the library. Non-residents have free access, but they can't take out materials. But the most interesting thing, and I'll show you a few pictures, is that in addition to being a library, it has all these innovative labs for different activities, which I'll show you in a moment. Plus, there's a big auditorium in there. There's what they call the Heritage Collection, which houses manuscripts, maps, going back long periods of time. And that's kind of, when you come into the library, it's kind of in a sunken area. It's almost below the surface. And there's a separate curator for that. They have a digital library, which they have in partnership with the British Library. Next slide. So this is the picture of the interior of the library. These are all the stacks. An amazing library in the sense that if you go and take a book out, you go to a kiosk and you put the book on a kiosk which reads the book. You obviously have some kind of a library card, records the fact that you're taking the book out, and no human contact. It's all done electronically. So when you return the book, you go back to one of these kiosks, you put the book in, and it records that you returned the book, and it goes into a process by which it goes through chutes underneath the floor, and it takes it back to wherever the particular stack is that represents. And then there were little desks at some of the ends of those stacks, and at that point there was somebody who actually took the book and put it back on the shelf. Kind of amazing. Some more slides, just we'll quickly go through. This is the auditorium, and there was actually a lecture going on during the time we were there. Next slide. Now this is one of the, this is the computer lab that's in the library, where anybody can go in, have access to computers, and do all kinds of things. Next one. This is a musical lab with all these musical instruments, and you can go in and use all these instruments, create whatever you want to create, try them out. Next one. Okay, and this was one of the manuscripts that was in this heritage section, which was down below. And that was a description of what it was going back to 2021. So the next visit we made was to Jazeera. As I mentioned, it's obviously housed in Qatar. It was founded in 1996. It was an Arab language news media at that point. 2006, there was an English editions that were broadcasting that was done. Had a strong association with the BBC, is again because of British connection to Qatar and is a protectorate. It has originally a lot of British journalists. It now has 94 nationalities apparently represented in the organization is what they indicated. It's a news organization. It is funded by the Qatar government, but they made strong notes about the fact that there's no government oversight of what goes into Al Jazeera, which, going back to one of the blockade issues, was these other countries wanted Al Jazeera shut down because they thought they were too critical of some of those other states, but they indicated that there's no government oversight. And the other comment that they were making was that the BBC is also supported by the British government, and they don't get anywhere near the same kind of criticism that Qatar gets for Al Jazeera. They are seeking to expand their funding away from Qatar government as well, so they're seeking some commercial funding as well. Originally, you could get Al Jazeera on as a TV channel or as a broadcasting channel. Now it's only available as on the internet, as I understand it. This is the Al Jazeera building. Next one. Went to the Ministry of Finance. They also talked about diversifying the economy. They are expanding their liquid natural gas facilities. They emphasized their need for food security, and that again is a result of the blockade, because of 90% of all their food came across that border, so concerned about having continual access and growth of an internal supply of food, different types of foods. There is they have a sovereign wealth fund, which they indicated there were $40 billion of it invested in the USA. And they indicated about 45% of their 2018 budget was used for infrastructure. And most of that, as I say, is going towards World Cup venues being developed, the metro system, and the road construction that's going on throughout. The World Cup, which is going to be in 2022, we met, and here again was an organization. The communication director was a Qatari woman who we met with. They're building 5 stadiums, capacity of about 40,000 apiece. It's all going to be linked together by a metro system, brand new metro system. Mentioned earlier that the NAT buses were being converted to natural gas. Interestingly enough, though, there are a number of major hotels in Doha in order to house what they expect to be people coming for World Cup. They are setting up cruise ships to be at the ports, and they're going to use the cruise ships as housing. They're just going to be set there and use it as a hotel, basically. The state we went to we never saw actual stadiums. You'll see a picture of it under construction, but the meeting we had was at a facility where the administration is located, and they talked about the stadiums. And one of the most interesting things is that, I know I'm running out of time, but the stadiums, they're all, FIFA is the organization that controls the World Cup. And apparently the rule is that all the World Cup has to be done in an open field. Can't be an enclosed stadium, in other words. So all of these stadiums are being built, but they have a sloping roof. So when you look at it from the ground level, you would think it's all enclosed. But if you look at it from the top, it's open at the top, just around the top. But the most fascinating part of it was, you can imagine that the temperatures to have a World Cup in the middle of the summer in Doha has got to be 100 or 110 degrees. And so when they were awarded the contract to do the World Cup, they moved the dates of the World Cup back in 2022 to November and December, when it's a little bit cooler. But in addition to that, all of these stadiums have an air conditioning system that will reduce the internal temperatures by about 20 degrees. And they have this airflow type of system that will float through that will reduce that temperature. It's amazing technology that they've come up with. The other interesting thing is that they're all prefab, they're all designed so that they can be reduced in size. There's no way that within Qatar they're going to be able to support a stadium of 40,000, 5 different stadiums. So they're all built so that they can be reduced in size. And one of these stadiums will be it was all prefab, and it will be totally dismantled and sent to a third world country that doesn't have a stadium, and whatever that country is apparently will be determined by FIFA, not by Qatar. They'll determine that themselves. I'll try to move through these quickly. This is a picture of this actually doesn't show you one of the stadiums, but this is the metro system that's being built. That's a drop-off point where there will be a stadium on the other side of that. Next slide. We went to the Air Force Base, largest Air Force base in the Middle East by the U.S. It's also where the Central Command of the Middle East is housed. It's 11,000 airmen that are stationed there. Military personnel from Qatar are also located. The Army is so forth located there, as well as the Air Force. Qatar supports this base financially, and just in January of this year, they announced an expansion of the airfield, both the airfield as well as the airfield basically is very close to the water, and so they're also developing a port so that military vessels, naval vessels, can have access from the Persian Gulf. And they're also, part of the expansion is taking place so that families of military personnel can come in. We also met with the charge d'affaires. Some of his comments were that he thought that the United Arab Emirates was the main leader of the blockade, not Saudi, which others have indicated. Thinks that it will be a protracted situation to try to resolve. The U.S. has offered to mediate, but there's no response on the part of those Gulf states. Didn't believe that Qatar was trying to expand their relationship with Iran, but that they needed to be a good partner with Iran in the sense that they needed it for the airspace I mentioned before, and there are also mutually owned gas wells in the Gulf, so that they needed to maintain strong relations with them. He viewed the government more open and autocratic, and he made reference again to the Shura Council, which we talked about, as being an area where there was citizen involvement. Next slide. The Museum of Islamic Art, the largest collection of Islamic art in the world, and I've got a few slides on that. There's also a new National Museum that just opened in March of this past year. I'd encourage you, if you're at all interested, Google National Museum of Qatar, and you'll see, again, a fantastic architecturally designed building. Next slides. This is the museum. This is the Islamic Museum. We'll go through these quickly. This is the interior, the court, kind of the atrium of the museum. Stairs. These are a few pictures of some of the artifacts that are in this. Is next slide. This is a carved wooden doors that go back to the 13th century, came from Turkey. This is, again, these are blown up so they're not very clear, but this is a picture. Go to the next slide. You'll see this is a monkey going back to the 1200s from Iran. This is Julfak, and that came from India. Next slide. That goes back to 6040. So those were just some of the things we saw. And so to end it all, not everything was meetings. We did have a number of opportunities to do some more social functions. The souk is a typical Middle Eastern market. You can, why don't you just go through the pictures, Sid, next. This is just a picture of an interior of the souk. Very typical market with food, spices, clothes, all kinds of crafts. Very popular, also dining establishments. We spent one evening there and walking through and then dining there. Next slide. The main recreational activity in Qatar seems to be going out to the sand dunes and going down the sand dunes with these vehicles. So we spent a late afternoon doing that one day. There are some of these kind of beach areas which are out in the sand dunes, and people come here for this is another recreational activity. This is a night scene of the architecture. Some of those buildings you may have seen before, and again at night you can see the picture of the Emir. This was actually taken from inside the Islamic Museum. All right, this was one of the most incredible things we saw. This is a mall called Al Hazim, built by a Qatari owner. I swear, it didn't cost $1 billion. It cost many, many, many millions of dollars. This is been built with Italian marble, Greek, Palestinian stone, marble from Greece in terms of the floor mosaic. Next slide. You can just kind of run through these. I had to get these pictures from actually something I found on the internet because some of my pictures didn't turn out as well. But I mean, it just an incredible setup. Next slide. This is another kind of view of the kind of marble and how it's set up. This is, so surrounding this, then there's this area, kind of an open mall area here with all of these buildings around it. If you sit out in here, and there are cafes and so forth in this center area, if you sit out in there, again, they have cooling technology that reduces the outside temperature by something like 10 degrees. Next slide. All right, and so now this is really what Qatar is outside of Doha. And so this is when we were out on those sand dunes, and it was late in the afternoon, but it's just all sand, but interesting kind of patterns. Next slide. And this was our group at the end. Okay. So, oh, I don't know.
Come on, where are you?
I think back here. Yeah. So anyway, just a final takeaway. You know, I think that after being through all of this, I've found that Qatar is very forward-thinking, very much a worldview about not only where they are, but what the issues are that they face in the Middle East. I think that one of the main messages and the reason for supporting this mission was they wanted to get out their own message about their view of the blockade, why it had happened, and why there really wasn't any basis for it from their standpoint. But I think it's also evident that the blockade has made them much more resilient, much more independent. As I say, they've had to do things in order to provide food resources and so forth. Obviously, the U.S. is a major ally, has that major military base there. Very open, hospitable and friendly people. And I would guess the only thing that I think we probably all thought at the end is where does this whole labor issue go in the long term, given the fact that there is only 10 or 15% that are actually Qatari. So with so many temporary workers there, you know, do they will they have a path to citizenship or some kind of more strong relationship? So that could be an issue that surfaces in the country going forward. But it is the wealth that is visible in all of that you see is just it was amazing. So good.